We now go to Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to follow the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who's doing sterling work in an area which is of increasing concern to this House and indeed to our country, as we see the impact of hostile state actors playing an increasingly important part in the way in which we think about our country's place in the world. And he's doing outstanding work in thought leadership and political leadership in that context. It was a privilege for me to serve on the Bill Committee for the National Security and Investment Bill. And it's also been a real privilege for me to work with my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, who has led the team in an exemplary manner, assiduous in the scrutiny of this bill, and bringing us together around a set of 30 amendments, more than 30 amendments, I think we tabled at committee stage, which unfortunately, whilst I have huge respect for the minister in charge of this bill, he unfortunately chose not to integrate any of our amendments into the bill, which I think is a pity, because as my honourable friend has pointed out from the dispatch box just now, we have approached this bill in a spirit of constructive engagement with the government, wishing to see the substance of it being put into place as rapidly as possible. It's long overdue. And it's a pity that that spirit, if you like, wasn't reciprocated by the government in terms of some of the amendments we tabled, which we genuinely were not doing from any partisan point of view. It was very much in the spirit of trying to improve the bill as much as we possibly could. But we are where we are. We're through the committee stage and now looking at the bill as it is. And through the committee stage, we heard from experts, as has already been mentioned, the former head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, and Charlie Parton, who is one of the leading experts on China. And they really were very enlightening contributions. And I think it's worth just touching on what they talked to us about, because I think it helps to set the backdrop and the context against which this bill is being put onto the statute book. And I think two of the key takeaways, if you like, from the evidence that we heard is that the impact of COVID is deeply troubling in terms of increasing the vulnerability of the British economy and of businesses to withstand the interest of, in terms of hostile foreign takeovers. And it feels very much like we're out on very choppy waters in a relatively difficult economic climate, but also relatively isolated, of course, having left the European Union. And we need to ensure that we do all we can to hold on to our strategic national assets and not allow them to be snapped up by investment vehicles and businesses that are sniffing around, to use the term of the honourable gentleman just now, sniffing around our business sector and potentially taking over businesses in a way that would be deeply damaging to our economy and to our national security. And the second key trend really that was highlighted was, of course, the rise of China. And I think it was made very clear by Mr. Dearlove and Mr. Parton and others that successive governments since 2010 have been profoundly naive and complacent in terms of the way in which we respond to the rise of China. We had the so-called golden era, which was supposed to be about economic integration that would lead to China then beginning to align with the rules and norms of the international rules-based order. And clearly the opposite has happened. And as a result of that naivety and complacency, we now find ourselves very exposed. and in a position that could potentially lead to the undermining of our sovereign capabilities. So it's against that backdrop that this bill is being introduced. And I wanted to focus on New Clause 5. But before I speak specifically in favour of New Clause 5, which is a really important amendment on which I worked with colleagues, including, of course, my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle upon Tyne Central, I wanted to just, first of all, talk about the intentions of the bill and whether it will achieve those goals. The bill seeks to protect Britain's national security from the threats by hostile business takeovers and investment vehicles, which are not aligned potentially with the UK's values and interests, and potentially are even actively hostile and seeking to cause harm to our country. But I think there's a potentially a flaw at the heart of the bill, which is that a key part of our national security is our economic security. Indeed, our economic security, I would argue, is a foundation stone of our national security, because our economic security underpins our long-term national security, in the sense that if we lose control of key parts of our economy, that leads to an undermining of our sovereignty and our sovereign capability, and to our prosperity, which has a knock-on effect in terms of our resilience and our national security. So we need to put our sovereign capabilities at the heart of this bill and ensure, therefore, that the government would be, when it's doing national security assessments, it's looking at long-term strategic structural threats, in addition to the more immediate threats of espionage, of intellectual property, of the range of other more immediate threats to our national security. So that's why at committee stage, I honed in, if you like, on two issues which I felt were most critical. It's around our critical national infrastructure, and then around enterprises and investment vehicles which have clear links and allegiance to other states. On the first point, the bill unfortunately neglects to define critical national infrastructure. The government consultation lists 17 sectors that might come under the national security regime's mandatory notification process. But it doesn't list and define critical national infrastructure as an asset class in itself. Therefore, if you look at the list of 17 sectors that are in the bill as it currently stands, and then you look at the list of 13 sectors that the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, which is a government body, of course, it defines 13 areas as critical national infrastructure. There is a missing overlap, i.e. there is a difference between the 17 listed in the bill and the 13 that are listed by the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure. So, and those 5 sectors are chemicals, defence, finance, health, and water. And I would argue, Madam Deputy Speaker, that those 5 sectors are absolutely crucial to our national interest. And to have potentially hostile foreign takeovers going on in those crucially important sectors should be something that should give all of us pause for thought, and should certainly give the government pause for thought, because these sectors form the basis of the safety and security upon which every citizen of our country relies. So I would strongly recommend that critical national infrastructure be defined as an asset class in this bill, and that gap be closed between the 17 sectors that are listed and the 5 sectors that are not included. Our critical national infrastructure, of course, needs protecting. And as Sir Richard Dearlove said in response to my question in the Bill Committee to the idea of including critical national infrastructure in the definition, he said, "I would certainly see that as advantageous, because it defines a clear area where you start and from which you can make judgments. But the truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have failed to protect these critically important national assets for a decade. And if you just look at the involvement of Chinese-based investment vehicles in our water sector, in our energy sector, in our nuclear sector, we see that this is a serious problem and needs to be fixed urgently. It's also part, I think, of a kind of laissez-faire approach that the government has taken, or that successive governments have taken since 2010. It leads to a sort of short-term business culture that opens the door to acquisitions and leads to us having by far the highest number of successful hostile takeover bids of any advanced economy in the world, and certainly as defined by the OECD. We've seen our strategic assets too often being flogged off to the highest bidder. The case of Arm, a jewel in the crown of British tech, has been mentioned by several honourable members, which is, of course, in the process of being sold off to NVIDIA, Huawei and Photonics, and of course, DeepMind to Google. And I absolutely agree with the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who said that was one of the most egregious decisions taken by a government in recent political history. And what it does, it undermines our sovereign capability. And as a result, so much of our critical national infrastructure is not in our own hands. In fact, 57 of our critical infrastructure supply chains depend on China, from energy suppliers to airports to personal protective equipment. And that is a dangerously exposed position to be in. And the repercussions, of course, were felt through the pandemic. Our lack of capacity to produce PPE has cost the UK taxpayer eye-watering amounts of money, and with shocking stories as well of so-called middlemen pocketing millions of pounds simply as acting as a broker between the British government and overseas suppliers. I'd like to turn now, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the issue of foreign state involvement and to state-owned enterprise and investment vehicles that are backed by states. Many of the so-called private takeovers and infrastructure investments are in fact being carried out by companies and investment vehicles which are a front for authoritarian state actors who have wider political and national security agendas and whose values are at odds with our own concepts of democracy, liberty, and the rule of law. The most obvious and pressing case is, of course, the role of the Chinese state, which is committed to expanding its influence economically, politically, and indeed militarily in order to become the world's leading global power. We need only recall the recent case of Imagination Technologies, which was the target of a hostile takeover attempt by an investment vehicle with direct links to the Chinese state. And of course, there's a substantial Chinese stake in Hinkley Point. We need to tighten our view and our definition of hostile foreign takeovers and when they have a particular role and where they owe allegiance to hostile foreign states. And that is set out in the statement of policy intent, but it is not in the bill. And as pointed out at committee stage, it really does need to be in there as a clear definition of an additional threshold, a higher threshold, if you like, a more assiduous look at the backers of investment vehicles and companies that are looking to take over British companies and interests. So, in addition to the comments on these broader issues of critical national infrastructure and the state-owned and backed enterprises, I think it's very important that we flag up the concerns around the fact that so much of this is sitting within the business department, within the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. That is really an issue because decisions are going to have a huge cross-departmental implications, and it would be better to have a cross-departmental unit that should be really bringing together the Treasury, the Home Office, the FCDO, the the security services, the MOD, and would follow a similar model to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. There were signs that BEIS was somewhat of a cheerleader for the Huawei deal, and that does not fill us with great confidence or optimism that a sufficiently astringent look is going to be taken at these issues if it's left exclusively in the hands of BEIS. There's also an issue around the change of incumbent at the cabinet level, the Secretary of State being potentially influenced. We would, of course, never cast such aspersions on the current incumbent, and we congratulate him on his promotion, but we really do need to make sure we have a belt and braces approach to this, and we need to ensure that undue influence is not being exerted. We've seen reports about so-called elite capture by foreign powers. We've seen the Russia report, and we would like to see far more assiduous action being taken. It's naive to think that we're not vulnerable to these influences. So,
if I could just interrupt the honourable gentleman, just to say we do have quite a few more speakers. We do have a fair amount of time, but I am hoping that speakers will be about 10 minutes, and he's been 15 now, so I hope that he might be bringing his remarks to a close before too long.
With apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am indeed finishing now. In conclusion, protecting our national security is just one element of protecting, nurturing and developing the vital sectors for the future. Technology sovereignty is going to be the defining issue of the coming decade. And the economic dislocation we've seen from COVID means that the case for action is stronger and more urgent than ever. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.